very quickly, just welcome everyone to this event. My name is Marissa. I'm CEO of United Nations Association UK. We are hosting today's wonderful event in our office. I'll be speaking a little bit later with my own reflections on the topic at hand. But for now, I will hand it over to these wonderful people here. And just to note, the event is being recorded currently. If this is not something you want to be included in, then unfortunately you will have to leave the call. And with that, let's get started. Have a seat.
Thank you very much, and welcome to this event hosted by UK UNA by Greenhouse Think Tank in collaboration with the Green European Foundation. We are part of a European-wide project exploring the links between geopolitics and degrowth, or geopolitics of a post-growth Europe. And to do that in London today, we have two panels of speakers. The first panel is focusing on the economic, trade links between countries, between European countries and those around the world. And then secondly, looking at the peace and military aspects, then an opportunity to bring those together at the end. Without further ado, let me introduce Casper and Gabriela to you, and Peter Newell, who is joining us online. So firstly, Casper. Casper is a lecturer in East Asian Studies at Leiden University in the Netherlands. He works on the Chinese and Japanese foreign policy as well as EU policy towards the East Asian region. He's especially interested in how, during an age of geopolitical rivalry with China, Europe can stand up for and defend democratic values while maintaining cooperation on issues such as climate policy. So, Casper, may I leave you the floor before we take a slightly different perspective from Gabriela on the relationships between Chile and Europe. But first, to you, Casper.
Thank you very much for that introduction. How much time do I have? I've been thinking.
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jonathan. Today, in fact, these few days, Vladimir Putin is making his first visit to China since the start of the war against Ukraine in 2022. This is for the BRI Forum, so it's the 10-year anniversary of Xi Jinping's and China's large infrastructure project, which is aimed at linking China with the wider world and especially with the global south, in fact. And what we're seeing now in Beijing is Russia, China, and several leaders from the global south discussing this, but celebrating this, and also signaling to a certain extent that they are looking for alternative international order. And their criticism is very much aimed at the global north and at the unequal economic structures that have been created basically since the end of colonialism, I would say, that they want to provide or create an alternative for. And I think us as progressives have some work to do in how we should respond to this effort. The effort by authoritarian countries to formulate alternatives to the international order. And I think, even though I think a lot of us also want to see an alternative to the current international order and to its inequalities and its injustice, and the lack of democratization of the international order definitely is considered a problem by all of us in this room. I think it should not be controversial to say, though, that the alternative offered by the authoritarian countries, such as China and Russia, is not one that we should want, and that their influence on the international order is a threat to our democratic way of life, I believe, here in the West, but also a threat to democratic life anywhere else, as well as the possibility of democratic life anywhere else. A big challenge, as slowly we are becoming more aware of this challenge internationally, and especially in the West, and we're entering this age of geopolitical rivalry and different visions for the international order. I would say that this challenge is that if there's one arena in which China and us and we, Western Europe, Europe in general, North America, as well as the global South, all need each other, it's on the issue of the climate crisis and cooperation on climate policy, where even if we just look at technological advances in green technology, for example, that are going to be quite essential over the next few decades, it's quite likely cooperation between us, if I just limit it to Europe at the moment, between Europe and China will remain essential. And it will be very hard to maintain this if the geopolitical situation as it is now and the relations of the West with China continue to deteriorate, because China has shown again and again they are willing to use the climate crisis and cooperation on it in mitigating it as leverage in order to coerce us into doing what they want. And this is only about to get, it's only just started. I think we'll see much more of that in the future. As the relations between the US and China have deteriorated over the last 2 years or so, actually a little bit longer, maybe 5 years or so, China has made very clear that cooperation on climate policy cannot be isolated from the relationship as a whole. And they refused to engage in discussions on climate as relations with the US continue to deteriorate. With Europe, we also see that there's a kind of encouragement by China for Europeans to play nice with China in order to then receive benefits in terms of climate cooperation. This could be seen after recent visits by the French president as well as the German chancellor to China, in which they struck a tone that was really quite, how should I say, quite compliant to Xi Jinping and generally to the Chinese leadership. Immediately, this was awarded, I would almost say, by several initiatives proposed by the Chinese in order to cooperate much more intensively on developing green technologies, both with France and Germany. Now, this is a very dangerous slippery slope. When if we continue to accept that cooperation on climate with China is dependent on us playing nice with China, like we will be at China's mercy as it tries to make the changes in the international order that it wants. So there, and the most dangerous part of that is that it is very much a possibility, although I don't say it's going to happen, but a possibility that China is going to invade Taiwan sometime during the next 10 years. And one thing of like this would be a global disaster from any perspective, but one perspective that's sometimes ignored is that also it would be a disaster for the green transition. This is because of Taiwan's crucial position in the chip supply chains, but also because, as I said earlier, cooperation on climate with China will remain essential. So we're stuck in this bind, I'm trying to say, where cooperation on climate is necessary. We've sort of come to believe that therefore we might need to compromise on other areas, playing nice with China, that is. But compromising on those other areas will make us look weak in the eyes of the Chinese and make an invasion of Taiwan therefore more likely. Just like our compliant attitude to Vladimir Putin after 2014, when we in the West made very clear to Putin that we were not willing to stand up for our values, not willing to stand up for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, encouraged him to then go further in 2022. So I'm afraid that therefore, this is sort of the bind that we're in with China that we need to move out of in some way. I think there are two ways that we need to combine in our China strategy with which we can pull this off. One of them is by leveraging technological choke points. That what I mean with that is basically technology that China will need over the next 10, 20 years that they do not have access to, which originates here and which they need. Vice versa is also going to be the case, quite likely. Nonetheless, like this is a leverage, something we can leverage, these technological choke points. And if you study certain Chinese scientists, like these choke points, have actually been identified by them, by Chinese scientists, who say like over the next 10 years, 20 years, we are going to keep needing these type of things that the West has and we do not. One of the most famous example maybe is the chips, but that's mostly for political reasons that we're now cutting China out of that development. But it also concerns things like robotics and new materials or advanced materials. So that's one point by which we can exert pressure on the Chinese and use leverage that hopefully will allow us to isolate to a certain extent our cooperation on climate from geopolitical competition. So we can still push back against China in the international, as it tries to change the international order, while at the same time pressuring them to keep cooperating on climate policy. Quite complicated, but this is what should be done, I think. So this means that we can, on the one hand, continue to aim for deterrence when it comes to Taiwan. So only a strong show of support for Taiwan from the West will make it clear to China that invading Taiwan is a bad idea. We can keep doing that and cooperate and not let China use climate as a bargaining chip in this way. On the other way that we can get out of this problem is, and now I'm coming to the topic of today, which is degrowth. So by simply reducing our dependencies generally, but especially our dependency on China for both the resources that we need for the green transition and certain like technologies that they already have the advantage over us, like development of electric vehicles, solar panels, etc. By pursuing degrowth, basically, we'll be less dependent on China in that sense, so reducing our dependencies, and then basically we can be more selective on how we cooperate or not with authoritarian states in the international order. Actually, same would go for countries like Saudi Arabia, Azerbaijan, etc. So that's one way I think that degrowth can actually be a geopolitical asset. After the start of the war against Ukraine, there's actually been an acceleration of the switch to renewable energy. However, this basically exchanged reliance on Russia for energy reasons with reliance on China. This is not desirable, and by pursuing this kind of smart degrowth, we could possibly use degrowth as an asset. Being less dependent on authoritarian states will make us more able, internationally speaking, to push back against their power and enforce also our red lines. And there's a danger in this, however. Reducing our dependencies through degrowth, or degrowth generally, also means that we simply need to import less of the resources that we would otherwise need for the green transition. And we would then have to question whether does that mean with our relationship, for our relationship with the global south. So it might well be the case that the global south is a very broad term, of course. But for example, countries in Africa prefer to pursue something more like green growth, where actually they will still be aiming at increasing their exports, and especially to the West. And this would then quite likely be the type of resources that they export that we would be needing for the green transition, like rare earths, etc. Rare earth metals, etc. So in order to avoid this, I think we also need a discussion, and this is where my scientific knowledge also sort of reaches its limit, but I think Gabriela will speak more about this too. To what extent we still need to import these kind of resources from other parts of the world or mine them here in Europe as we pursue degrowth. Because as far as I understand, there is scientists who say that basically in a very successful degrowth situation in Europe, we will still need to import a certain amount of these type of resources from that are mined elsewhere. I hope Gabriela will speak a little bit more about this. I don't quite have the detailed knowledge whether this is true or not, but it's an important discussion to have, I believe. However, so yeah, addition to reducing these dependencies, I think we should aim also for diversification in terms of when we still do import those type of resources from the global south, that should not be China the way it is now to a great extent. Now we are dependent on China. If we diversify that to other parts of the world, this could also be an opportunity for us to aim for a radically new relationship with those countries in the global south that are no longer so much based on extractivism and the neo-colonial economic policies that we have imposed on those parts of the world in the past. Whether that will happen is still very much a question mark. I mean, there are very good initiatives that give us hope, I think, by the EU, such as the Global Gateway, which is in a way the EU's answer to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative that aims to, or sort of aspires to, another relationship with the global south where we can be an alternative to Chinese and Russian power. I still think within the Global Gateway, though, like the role, the central role of large businesses, large companies from the West is too strong. And in a way, the Global Gateway and European foreign policy in general should be much more and progressive. And thereby we should approach the global south as true equals. And only in that way can we be honest about why the power of China and Russia in the global south is growing so much. A lot of that has to do with our own behavior. Therefore, I do think pushing back against the power of these authoritarian states globally does also mean a complete rethinking of our own foreign policy in a much more progressive and radical direction. So yeah, that's my contribution.
Thank you very much, Casper. And I can almost already see the potential links between, you know, Chinese manufacturing. For example, I think we've had £1 billion sales of the MG, which is now a Chinese-owned motor brand. But that's mainly electric vehicles, of which the materials for that are imported from other countries. So it feels like the tentacles of Chinese business and the way it links to operations here do literally extend around the world. And maybe you might give us a little bit more perspective on that, Gabriela. So I'd like to introduce Gabriela Cabana-Alvear, who's a transdisciplinary scholar trained originally in sociology in Chile and draws from political ecology and feminist theoretical perspectives, including a focus on energy planning in Chiloé, which is in the south of Chile, in the context of climate emergency at the London School of Economics. Gabriela is part of the Centre of Social Environmental Analysis and the Chilean Network of Basic Income and the Basic Income Earth Network, and is active, I think, also here in London in the Energy Growth Network. So over to you, Gabriela.
Thanks for that, Ecolo, and thanks all of you for being here. It's also great to see all the members of Degrowth London present in this discussion. It's a very broad topic, and I'm going to try to be brief because I really would like to have time maybe to have some reactions on what each of us are saying. And I think maybe the way I always try to give my input in this kind of big debates is how I ended up being interested in these topics while doing my own ethnographic research. I'm an anthropologist, and that's like the way I understand things, very located in particular places. And I arrived to Chiloé, which is like this place that has like a very strong wind, and it's being seen like a new frontier of expansion of renewable energies, which in principle should be something good, of course, but that is already generating a lot of conflict that has to do with historical trends of dispossession and of bad practices in the way energy is being planned and corporations are doing their projects. And while doing research there, I realized suddenly one day appeared this idea that Chile would become like a number one world exporter of green hydrogen. And I found it really interesting. This was announced out of the blue. I didn't know anything about this. I had spoken with people in the ministry and they didn't know about it. And suddenly it was all over the place. And this is it's been like something recurring in the last 2 or 3 years, actually. And now it's all over the place in Latin America. And many other countries have also announced their strategies for exporting green hydrogen. To different people. In the case of Chile in particular, the EU is an important commercial partner. In other cases, it's Australia. I think with Brazil, China is very important. So we're seeing like all these different alliances emerging in these projects. And what I found more interesting about this announcement was the scale of it. Because it started with this idea of Chile has so much sun in the desert, the driest desert in the world. We have so much wind in the south, including places like Chiloé, but not just that, like very far south in Magallanes. There was this sense of there's just so much energy abundance that we need to do something with, and we need to find a way of putting that in a flask and export it, which is kind of what green hydrogen does. And none of this was considering at all the need of limits, to respect social and environmental limits, and the idea that if you were to actually exploit all the energy potential that you have in the country, this would be an environmental disaster. I mean, this would be absolutely terrible for the ecosystems that are so fragile, that are already going through a lot of stress, and this would like impose even more stress. Just for you to get a sense of the scale, if the strategy for exporting green hydrogen is successful, towards 2050, roughly half of the renewable energy infrastructure of the country would be destined to producing green hydrogen for export. So this is huge. I mean, we're seeing that so much of the possible space and possible infrastructure that could go for the country is going to be destined for providing green hydrogen that's going to be shipped over to Europe in a process that, I mean, we can also talk about that, in a process that also at the level of efficiency doesn't really make sense. Green hydrogen is not really good at being put in tanks and being shipped over. It's a very complicated energy vector. And nonetheless, we are still aiming at that this is going to take over, and we're still trying to attract foreign investment. And just now I was checking the news, Gabriela Cabana-Alvear, our president, was on a tour here in June, and he was trying to consolidate and close all these deals of trade with the European Union on importing green hydrogen and attracting investment on that. So this is extremely problematic because, as I said, already today, which we have a very small fraction of renewable energy, and the renewable energy we will need for our own transition and for the needs of energy poverty in Chile. Already at that level, there is a really growing environmental conflict, for very good reasons. I mean, this is really the places that are seen as empty for the construction of solar or wind farms are definitely not empty. And they're very fundamental for the people that get their livelihoods from there. If this is happening today, when there is still not really a green hydrogen industry there, imagine if this were to succeed, and we would end up with all these massive projects that also add pressure to the environmental evaluation system, and are more and more pushing for all this idea of streamlining environmental approvals that is becoming more and more common. Now we have our economy and treasury minister speaking about the need to overcome this bureaucratic nuisance, which they're not. They're very important processes to make all of this democratically, and not just like make it a stamp that you give to projects as they come. And all this pressure is building up because we are still trapped in this idea that we need to provide the raw materials for whatever level of consumption our buyers will determine, so that the current energy demand levels are going to be sustained into the future, and actually are going to keep growing using importing materials like hydrogen, and I'm going to say something about lithium in a moment. And there is just no conversation at all about recognizing that fossil fuels were an exceptional period, very short exceptional period of energy abundance, or an apparent energy abundance of cheap energy that now we're realizing was not really cheap, right? Like the cost, we're feeling the cost right now, but it seemed very cheap, very dense. It's a very dense energy vector. And we're trying to replace that now with this thing, green hydrogen, and it just doesn't work. I mean, the implications, not just in the land use, but also in the amount of materials that you need to produce all these wind farms and all these solar panels, and how short-lived they are, the limited range of recycling that the materials in this infrastructure has. I mean, I could go on, like we could go into the details of this, but none of this is being considered, and really the scale is very scary. I mean, when I read the document of the green hydrogen strategy, I thought it had to be wrong. Because it's just done in a way that completely ignores the consequences of trying to implement a policy like this. Fun fact, it was made by McKinsey, So, we have like private consultancies designing the policies of our countries. This is a completely undemocratic way of designing energy policy. And this is then when it's taken by countries here in Europe to say, oh, this is great, Chile wants to sell us with hydrogen. But actually, like, if you see just a little bit below that, we can see like these very, very problematic ways of making decisions. And this applies for lithium as well. Chile has one of the largest lithium reserves in the planet. And again, the government presented earlier this year a new policy for the production and extraction of lithium, which was immediately responded by different coalitions of indigenous people and other peasant communities that live of these wetlands, because South Flats are wetlands, presenting that this was completely unknown, like they had no idea it was going to happen. There was no previous consultation, and now the government is trying to kind of get them on board with a set of goals that was already announced from the get-go, and in which there was no say in, for instance, the need to design extraction, because we will need minerals. This is true if we want to do the energy transition, but not any energy transition can just happen like this. It cannot be to sustain an imperial way of life here in Europe or anywhere. Even to sustain an imperial way of life in Chile doesn't really make sense. It's still oppressive and wrong. And again, like, this was completely absent in the political debate. So yeah, I mean, I'm gonna just stay there with these two cases that I think are very telling. And yeah, to question, I mean, from this side of the planet, like, what does it mean from a European perspective to negotiate trade in terms that are actually just, and not just take the idea that many countries will want to sell and many governments will want to sell things, because under the system in which we work, we need foreign currency, and we are under this unequal system. But actually to think about the communities and the people on the ground that so often, in the majority of cases, have no say in these like big level decisions on industrial policies of their countries. So yeah, I think that's in a nutshell what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Gabriela. So two very different perspectives, two very specific circumstances, and I think it's good to start this debate not at a high theoretical level, but actually starting to explore some of the practicalities on the ground. But someone who's been looking at this in this area of international relations for a long time is Peter Newell. So I'd like to bring Peter in online as much as possible to make Peter a big screen rather than a little screen on the computer. Peter Newell is a professor of international relations at the University of Sussex, where he works on the political economy of climate change and energy transitions, which I think is very relevant to this debate here. He previously worked at the universities of Oxford, Warwick, and the University of East Anglia, and has had positions with NGOs, Climate Network Europe, and Friends of the Earth. He has sat on the board of Greenpeace UK and Brussels-based NGO Carbon Market Watch, and is a member of the advisory board of Greenhouse think tank. His books include Globalization and the Environment, Climate Capitalism, Governing Climate Change, Climate for Change, the Effectiveness of EU Environmental Policy, Global Green Politics, and Power Shift. So I'm hoping Peter has something to say on this here today. So over to you, Peter.
Great, thanks very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much. Well, and thanks Jonathan, and to the other organisers for the invitation to this event. And sorry not to be there in person. I've got childcare obligations as well as dog and chickens in the background, so there's quite a high chance of disruption. So apologies for that at the outset. But I guess, I mean, it was great to hear what Gabriela was saying from a sort of anthropological perspective around, what some of these transition policies look like on the ground and who gets consulted and who's excluded in these sorts of processes. I guess I'm coming at this also as the position of a professor of international relations. And I think the questions we're wrestling with today are critical, but also actively and hugely neglected in terms of what would a degrowth agenda mean for the conduct or for the nature of international relations. And I say that against a context in which there's clearly more attention to and increasing popularity of ideas around degrowth. But at the same time, we're also seeing the obvious failings of the conventional orthodox growth model and its sort of militarized or extractivist versions, the ways in which they're unfolding in the world today. So a lot of what I'm just going to say now relates to an interview that I did with Jonathan, so I can put the link in the chat for other online participants afterwards, and it was called Steering Away from Extractivism, and that's really what I'll focus on today. But it does, many of the ideas or the things that we discussed in that interview came out of a book called Global Green Politics, and so if anyone's interested in that, I have some spare copies, in fact, so drop me an email with your address and I can send you a copy. So for me, the entry point for this conversation is to think about what are some of the sources of geopolitical competition and violence and the sorts of extractivism that we see today, and to sort of summarize it in a nutshell. If the acquisition of ever more resources to feed expanding production and consumption is no longer a core aim of state policy, which clearly it wouldn't be in a sort of degrowth scenario, which is what we're being asked to imagine today, then the violence required to access and maintain access to those resources in the ways that Gabriela was just describing also becomes more redundant, or would hopefully become more redundant. In other words, this constant drive to feed growth, whether it's high carbon or low carbon growth, means extracting fossil fuels from ever widening frontiers, often in poorer, more remote areas, but also for the critical minerals that both previous speakers have talked about, whether it's lithium or cobalt or rare earth minerals. And this is driving conflicts between governments and indigenous peoples, as Gabriela was just saying, but regional tensions of one sort or another. And if anyone's not seen it, I'd steer you towards the Environmental Justice Atlas, which colleagues in Barcelona have been putting together, but in conjunction with many other researchers around the world, highlighting some of these flashpoints, if you like, in the global economy at these frontiers of extractivism. And this is sort of the consequence of the everyday in which the economy is organized at the moment, and therefore what we have to try and change. And so for me, the only escape route from these sort of toxic cycles of conflict and patterns of geopolitics, which Casper was talking about more broadly, is to try and break that connection between growth and violence, the link between the acquisition of ever more resources, the exploitation of labor that obviously goes with that. Because unless you deal with the nature of growth and how we're pursuing it, then you can't do that. You can't break that cycle, that intimate relationship between the pursuit of growth at the moment and the sorts of forms of violence and exclusion that we're seeing. Now, a key challenge, and this is something I discuss quite a lot in the book, two ideas about degrowth in international relations, at least in my discipline, comes from people who propagate this idea of the liberal peace doctrine. And this essentially means that high levels of economic interdependence, i.e. a closely entwined trading, production set of relations between states, is good for peace. Okay. And so the challenge to green thinking about the need to de-link to some extent and to localize economies is that this could have a series of disruptive effects that, shortening supply chains, reducing flows of international trade would reduce economic interdependence, and therefore conflict can then become more viable. And of course, the examples they point to are the world wars, basically, that as trade barriers became erected, there were more controls on capital flows, etc. Economies were effectively able to shut themselves off, and that therefore laid the pathway towards conflict. War became more viable, if you like, because of the reduced interdependency. So this is an idea that circulates a lot in my discipline. I think it's something that green thinkers need to take seriously. And there's a corresponding fear that the more you disengage from the global economy as part of a degrowth agenda, that you have fewer bargaining chips. In other words, what gives the UK or the EU that influence that it does have in the world derives from its commercial, business, economic power of one sort or another. So what do you do in a context in which that is actively and to some extent deliberately diminished? Now, my response to that, personally at least, is to say that some of that analysis misreads the deeper drivers of conflict in war, which for me are also, and I think Gabriela's intervention pointed to this, are also located in the social and the economic and forms of environmental instability. Whereas this liberal peace idea is just talking about interstate cooperation and interstate war. Whereas, of course, most people experience violence and dispossession often from their own state or from regional instability, and not just from these sort of, more infrequent, gladly interstate wars. But also to flip the argument and say, just because there's to some extent a delinking economically, that you can't at the same time still have quite a globalist outlook. In other words, you can try and build a less extractivist solidarity type economy, if you like, and at the same time try and push political cooperation in the way Casper was describing around climate change or human rights or development or a whole set of other issues. So, some delinking economically does not imply isolationism, basically. So I think that's, an argument that Greens need to put forward far more effectively. And it's also the case, of course, that because of this drive to overextend ourselves and to extract resources on all fronts all around the world, regions like our own, and obviously particularly the UK, you end up getting embroiled in conflicts around the world, and that process of extraction, as we've seen historically and in the current moment, leads to resentments and tensions and conflicts, going back to colonial times, but still today, the ways in which ecologically uneven exchange flows through the global economy. So in other words, if there's less of that those extractivist patterns of trade and commerce going on, then some of the resentments, the conflicts, the tensions that go with it may be reduced. So that would be a sort of the positive spin that you could put on attempts to try and think differently about growth, or even to go for degrowth. So geopolitics would obviously look very different if a degrowth agenda was pursued, but it might strengthen the EU or UK's ability to operate in some area. For example, as Casper was saying, our inability in a way to stand up to powers like Russia and China is precisely because we're so utterly dependent on importing their products. Right, with gas in the case of Russia, and most commodities, frankly, in the case of China. So if that dependence is loosened or reduced, then there's more scope to intervene in other ways, or to make other sort of political claims, rights-based claims and demands and so on. So it gives you to some extent more latitude and freedom of maneuver politically if there's that reduced economic dependence. But of course, instead of trying to shape the behavior of actors like Russia or China or Saudi Arabia through traditional means such as trade sanctions or threat of conflicts, which are the classic tools of state diplomacy in a way, it would be more about reducing their material and military power by stopping importing their products, i.e. the less you're dependent on fossil fuels. And of course, this was the hope in the wake of the Ukraine crisis, that governments would realize how dangerous it was to be so utterly dependent on authoritarian regimes for their energy supply, and move in a different direction. Of course, in some instances, we've seen the opposite maneuver by many governments, but it should underscore claims and demands for things like a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. That's something close to my heart, and I've been campaigning for, and I know many Greens support it. So for me then, just to sort of sum up that discussion, I think actively pursuing a degrowth agenda might impact on some of the drivers of conflict, because it's not just about the interstate picture, which people in international relations focus on. That's one part of... Are you losing me? Can you hear me now? Yeah, so as I was saying, I think, pursuing a degrowth agenda can impact some of the drivers of conflict, particularly if we're thinking of it not just in terms of interstate conflicts, but, regional drivers or the social environmental drivers. But of course, this has to be combined with another issue very close to Greens' hearts, which is about deepening democracy and social control over resources. In other words, the whole agenda around recommoning and taking back control over certain resources. Because a lot of the extractivism is fueled by elite demands and consumption patterns. It's by quite a small minority, globally speaking. And so I think greater democratic scrutiny over resources and the impact of decisions in richer parts of the world, in terms of what they mean for resource struggles elsewhere, is really important to avoid us, and I say us as in the UK, or us more broadly in Europe, passing on the social environmental costs of transition onto poorer societies. So in terms of the prospects of the EU playing a sort of more positive or progressive role in the way that others have described, clearly there's going to be some skepticism about whether the EU is either willing or able to provide that sort of role, when its agenda is far more focused on a conventional green economy agenda. And a lot of what it's doing, as Gabriela was describing, is really promoting the interests of European companies through bilateral and regional trade and investment agreements. So I do think there needs to be a conscious attempt to try and shift power within the EU in terms of, areas dealing with trade and finance, and putting more emphasis and power in the hands of those dealing with social and environmental issues. But it would require also controls on corporate lobbying, which is, of course, driving a lot of the growth agenda and the way it's narrowly pursued in the EU, and a rethinking of the overall purpose. And so for me, is that bigger picture almost about the vision of development that's being pursued here. Because even if you think of the Sustainable Development Goals, one of the number one goal is around continued economic growth, and it assumes still that that's crucial to tackling poverty and all the other goals that we have, many of which are environmental. And clearly, that's not the case, as we're sort of overshooting planetary boundaries in all directions. So that does prompt the need to think about how to shrink and share the economy. How do we share remaining resources, shrink the economy and share remaining resources in fairer ways? And of course, that does mean reducing and challenging existing patterns of production and consumption. And degrowth is clearly one, but not the only way to do that. And I'll stop there.
Okay. Part two, slightly different part two. So Gabriela's going to have to go shortly. So we're going to take questions and answers for the first session and then move straight into the second session. So I've got a question from Ryan Hart, who's online about universal basic income. So I can put to yourself to start with. Any comments from the panel to start with from all three of you on that? But if anyone else has any questions for Gabriela, please come forward with those, and then we'll revert to questions for Casper and Peter after that. So first of all, do we need a truly universal basic income? This means a global basic income combined with excellent universal services in order to achieve economic degrowth. Many arguments are presented for economic growth. One of them is the global abolition of financial poverty and hunger. That's from Ryan Hart, so I don't know who would like to lead off with that one.
Yeah, I think we're being invited to start our video so people can see us.
Can do that. Oh,
Yeah.
later.
Start video.
Yeah, because we're with the camera. Yes, great.
Brilliant.
See us now.
Okay. And we need to just change the angle slightly. So we've got all of us in. Oh, that's brilliant.
That's right.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Okay, I can answer that question. Okay, I love this question. It's a huge question and something that we could also be discussing for hours. This is a topic that I work a lot in also. I've been doing research and advocating for basic income for many years. And exactly, I think what Reinhardt is saying is precisely the case, and it's precisely one of the things that when we think about how to exit this situation in which we are, can help us think about alternatives. So for me, basic income is really a way out of extractivism, and it's a way of creating space for more autonomous practices that are often displaced by the need of working with a wage. And yes, one of the main discussions also that was mentioned in the question is that how to implement basic income is very important. Many people think that if it's not fully global, a basic income will not really have the impact, the empowering impact that it might have. So yeah, I mean, definitely for many of us in the basic income movement, advocating for this in the wider scale possible, so it's truly unconditional, it's truly universal, it's fundamental to achieve sustainability. And if you're interested in this, there is a growing literature now, and just I'm mentioning this for people in the call as well, that is talking about this, about basic income as a tool for social ecological transformation, which means rethinking a number of things, rethinking our relationship with the welfare state, our relationship with how we fund our policies, our relationship with money, and the design of money indeed, because one of the key questions that come up when we talk about basic income is how to pay for it. And this, again, brings us back to the question of money and how we issue money. So all this is another huge debate, but I definitely think that, yes, one of the first things to start thinking about regenerating economies and also exiting practices of consumerism and of, like unsustainable work. Very often, people that live in places of extraction are forced into taking jobs in the extractive industry that are very damaging for their own land, and having a basic income would allow them to say no, for instance. All these kind of things are possibilities that can be opened with a basic income. And yeah, and I could say much more, but I'm gonna limit my remarks to that. So thank you very much for that question.
Anything you want to add on that particular question?
I can just say very briefly that I agree that it would be extremely good, but that from my specialization, as in what's going on in China, that even though I can speculate and fantasize about how great it actually be for them as well, when they deal with domestic insecurity, like if they can provide more security through basic income, would be great. But this discussion doesn't exist in the Chinese Communist Party, so we can fantasize about it. But a global basic income, yeah, I just don't see any movement there whatsoever. And that is a large part of the globe that is becoming more powerful. So I don't know, it's not a very optimistic message, but in terms of ideals, I totally agree. It would be great.
And just online, Peter, is there anything you want to add? I don't know if you're with us. I think you were there all the time. It was us that went away rather than you earlier on. I don't know if you're there now.
Yeah, I just got the message saying I'm unmuted. Yeah, no, nothing to add to that. I may agree with Gabriela. I think if we're thinking about sort of rewiring the economy in quite a basic sense, we have to rethink, work, production, and consumption. Sort of those three and others, of course, key pillars. And I think basic income scheme is one key way of doing that, of addressing certain inequalities and providing a sort of key core safety net for poor and more vulnerable groups. So yeah, I think it's a crucial part of the picture. But I'm happy to come in more on other issues.
Any other questions for this panel? We can always come back for another round of questions at the very end. I'm sure that Marissa and Frank may have comments on things like basic income and how all of these things fit together in their introductions, or even follow-up questions later. So any other more questions from either the virtual world or from here in London? Yes, sir, at the front.
I have a question for Peter and for others.
Okay.
Can you hear me, Peter?
If you start with the question, then I can repeat it.
Basically, I wanted to know about he talked at one stage about saying that fewer resources and would help lead towards degrowth, which I accept. But then he said that this would not necessarily mean an increase in isolationism. And I'd like him to say, a little more as to why that would be the case, and for anybody else to comment on that.
Thank you. I don't know if you got that, Peter. So this was a reflection on your comments that if we follow a degrowth pathway, that would mean using fewer resources. But he also said that that a key strand would be to avoid isolationism. How can we avoid isolationism if we have fewer resources? Maybe if you can lead off, and then I'll invite Gabriela and Casper if they want to add anything to that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, what I was pointing to was that I can imagine scope for delinking and very different sort of trading relationships and modes of exchange globally. And some might see that as a shift towards sort of localism and certainly shifting the nature of those relationships. But that's not incompatible, it strikes me, with at the same time increasing, multilateral exchanges or regional responses around things like, tackling poverty or promoting human rights or dealing with issues of gender injustice or racial injustice or whatever it might be. So I don't see those two things as incompatible. I don't think because you're consciously delinking, which in itself, in a way, is an act of global solidarity. So it's not isolationist in and of itself. So I don't see why that has to be incompatible with, at the same time, enhancing ties and cooperation and a globalist outlook. In fact, I would say that degrowth, in a way, and attempts to try and bring about a very different type of economy is a globalist move. It may look like there's a sort of severing and a disconnecting from certain modes of exchange, but it's disconnecting from exploitative modes of exchange in preference for trying to do something different. So I think you can delink economically, but be more proactive, more globalist, more multilateralist, politically, culturally, socially.
I like the idea of being sort of having an international cultural exchange rather than maybe an international trade exchange, which is certainly an unequal trading exchange today. I don't think that either of you like to. So in that case, we've got another question online from Professor.
Yeah, Marissa, yes.
Well, thank you very much for coming here, Gabriela. We'll share the links afterwards, and if you're happy, we might share the links to the interview that you did for those interested online, or within the notes after the meeting, so people can go out and read what they like. But thank you very much for
Thank you.
coming today.
Apologies, I have to leave, but thanks.
Thanks very much. Pritam Singh, your question.
Yes, thank you. My question is to Casper. When he was saying that, EU or maybe America, but maybe his focus was on EU, should leverage their whatever powers with China, or maybe that's not the right word. He was saying that we need to decrease our dependence on China and Russia, and because they're authoritarian regimes, and we can leverage through by kind of putting pressure on the technological transfer to China and Russia. Now, I don't dispute that China and Russia both are authoritarian regimes, but the way he presented, that may not be actually his idea. It looked like that EU and USA are unproblematic. That whether the economics or the political or the international politics of EU is purely democratic, and if only EU and the Western political system is able to assert itself and decrease dependence on America, is all fine. But in terms of the global power dynamics, it's actually US and Europe to a great extent, which are the main levers. I mean, of course, China is increasing in importance, Russia is increasing in importance, the BRICS countries, India and Brazil are increasing in importance. But still, the balance of economic power remains with the West. To remain uncritical of the West and to even kind of say that our democratic values can be furthered by decreasing dependence on China, etc., to me seems to be a flawed argument. I mean, he may not be subscribing to that, but that's how the presentation came out, that we are all fine. We just need to decrease our dependence on them and push our leverage so that we can bring about some kind of democratic changes on them. So I was uncomfortable with that kind of articulation.
Thank you, Pritam. Casper, yours for a response to that particular point.
Thank you very much, Professor Singh. You make some very good criticism there. I accept maybe in my presentation I wasn't clear enough about some of these issues that you raised. I did try to start with saying that China and Russia are presenting a challenge to the international order as it exists now, and try to challenge the global north in the unequal power relations, economic power relations that we have created with the global south, and that we should not support that challenge because their alternative is worse. However, I did try to say, and it is my opinion, that we should in fact change that international order, and I think it in fact weakens us in the long run, things like extractivism and the neo-colonial economic policies that we have imposed on the global south. And that degrowth is an opportunity for us as well to make amends. And in a way, I tried to argue that we should combine, or that degrowth is an opportunity for us to combine the two. So on the one hand, we have to push back against China and Russia. That's simply morally necessary. Their influence on the international system is reduced. It sounds harsh and it sounds very, realist and maybe even a little bit right-wing. But I think progressives too should labor in that direction. However, I definitely think the reason why China and Russia are gaining strength in the global south and becoming more trusted partners for countries in the global south is due to our own behavior of northern countries, European countries and the US, who have pursued these neo-colonial economic policies, have not treated global south countries as equals. So there should be a new radical type of foreign policy thinking in Europe that starts rethinking our relationship with the global south. So I accept your criticism in the sense that my presentation wasn't clear, but I do hope that we are more aligned in our thinking than you might have seen from my presentation. But thank you very much for your good points.
Thank you. And just a small point for me, I understand that this year is the 50th anniversary of the emerging of the new I think it's the new international economic order, which emerged from the global south as different ways of trying to rebalance the international scene. And I think a lead proponent was the then Prime Minister or President of Guyana in South America, and that hasn't progressed and hasn't become the dominant narrative. But maybe now is the time to look at those relationships to be rethought and to restructure things right across the world from the UN. But I think it's fair to say that the most powerful body of the UN at the moment is the UN Security Council, and the UN is dominated not by voices from all countries equally, but from particular countries in a very strong and dominant manner, and militarism is part of that. So I think maybe this is an ideal world to transition to the second part of our sphere. So if you don't mind, Casper, we might do a changing of the seats, and I think we're going to bring along a flip chart as well as I introduce Marissa back to join us, and also Frank Meeussen to effectively have a part two of this debate. So we started looking at, yeah, please do. We started looking at the notions of degrowth and what that means in terms of the relationships between Europe and other parts of the world. But to actually put that into practice, that's framed through the space of governance and the political relationships between countries. But often it's not economics that defines those relationships, it's issues of power and power dynamics. And with that, I might ask both of you to give your perspectives before we open for questions yet again, and then lead to maybe a wider discussion that links us together. So I don't know which of you like to kick off, but we have an agreed running order. Well, may I just introduce Marissa again? So Marissa has served as Chief Executive Officer of the United Nations Association for the UK here since April 2022, and she's originally from Silicon Valley in California, where Marissa began her advocacy career in human trafficking prevention. After moving to the UK, she co-founded the Centre for Feminist Foreign Policy, where she served as UK Executive Director prior to her role here since 2016. So, Marissa, really welcome to hear your perspectives on the subject and lead us into the second half of our event this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I got plugged into this conversation with you, Jonathan, to this interview series that you're putting on, and it just strikes me how complementary feminist thinking is to degrowth. So I think first I'll give a little brief overview of kind of my particular feminist lens and why I think this is a useful tool to aid in understanding what exactly we can do to achieve degrowth goals. So I consider myself first and foremost a feminist activist. I bring a feminist lens to foreign policy. That's kind of the basis of my research, is looking at lots of different issues, but taking this particular analytical perspective and being able to bring a power analysis grounded in feminist theory, and particularly grounded in intersectional feminism, which stems from critical race theory and stems from Black feminist theory. So this means there's a real groundedness in looking at how different social categories and social identities overlap to give someone access to power or prevent them from accessing power, and why this is. So this isn't just about gender equality, which is obviously the foundation of feminist thinking, but this also means looking at racial equality. This means looking at sexuality, ethnicity, etc. All of the various different social categories that we all define ourselves by. And I think one of the big challenges that I see to kind of realizing some of these loftier goals within the degrowth movement is how power is conceptualized. And I think this is a sticking point that needs a little bit of theoretical kind of juice behind it. So quickly, I'll just say the gist of how I come at any given issue with my feminist lens is saying who has power, who doesn't have power, why, what's the context, and then how do we resolve this? Does this need resolving? Is there an imbalance? How do we rebalance this? And so I looked at kind of the current geopolitical landscape, and I think there are two main ways that we recognize power today. There are lots of ways, but I think two broad ones are economic power and military power. So we don't appreciate gender equality or smaller markers of well-being as something to be taken seriously in these conversations about what is power, what is a powerful state, what is a powerful community. But arguably, these very basic fundamentals of what makes a person happy, secure, what makes them feel safe, these are really basic things. This is access to healthcare, this is access to affordable housing, this is you know, being able to afford your bills and eat good, healthy food. These things make people far safer than the military does. So I'm going to spend the rest of my time trash talking militarism. So I think the way I see militarism is so defined by the work of Cynthia Enloe. She's this amazing feminist thinker and writer. I strongly encourage you to look up her work if you haven't come across her already. She's written extensively on militarism. She kind of started back in the 80s and is one of the most prolific feminist IR thinkers. So she defines this, I'll read her quote. Militarism is a step-by-step process by which a person or a thing gradually comes to be controlled by the military or comes to depend for its well-being on militaristic ideas. So to me, militarism is about a society that is okay with state-sanctioned violence and military action is the default norm for handling situations of conflict. So I really like to use nuclear weapons as an example of how this dynamic works at a global scale. There are 5 permanent members on the Security Council. We've got France, Russia, China, the UK, the US. These are the 5 nations that were originally granted the right to possess nuclear weapons under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Because they're the permanent members, they also have veto power. So anything they don't like, they just say no to, and that's it. Nothing can be done. They also have very big economies. So there's an overlap in this power dynamic here. Nuclear weapons are not just weapons, they're a symbol of power. They've become a representation of how influential a state is, how powerful a state is. And there's a huge history of gendered politics embedded within nuclear weapons as well, within nuclear policy, creating this connotation between masculinity and militarism, nuclear weapons, and peace building with femininity. This is quite a general overview, but broadly, because we exist under a patriarchal society, femininity is equated to weakness, and masculinity is equated to strength and power and might and prestige, and all the things that our current world order and the way foreign policy is currently structured is built around. So giving up something like nuclear weapons is a process of emasculating. And again, because of our patriarchal society, this is not something seen as desirable. You know, just a quick note on money, for example. So we're talking about where could funding possibly come from for a universal basic income. Nuclear weapons expenditure in the UK. There's a program to create 4 new dreadnought class submarines for housing nuclear weapons. And I believe it will begin in 2030. This is estimated to cost about £41 billion. and this is the government's figures in a poll recently, 40% of the British public support the UK's possession of nuclear weapons. So we see where money is going to kind of, yes, there's the realist argument that, as Russia is threatening Ukraine, they have a large nuclear arsenal. The UK now needs to be building up their nuclear arsenal. This is, that's not the reality. The reality is that this is power positioning. They're trying to signal certain things by building up the nuclear arsenal. And the fact is the British public supports this. So we also have the issue of convincing the public that these principles are inherently flawed, and this is not how we keep a society safe. The reason I like this particular metaphor of power with nuclear weapons is because I think this also applies to capitalism very well. There's Arundhati Roy, someone I've been reading recently, describes capitalism as a weapon of mass destruction, saying that in the context of nuclear weapons, in the context of capitalism, this is a quote, "The earth is viewed as a resource to be mined by human societies in their wars of supremacy against each other, even at the cost of annihilation to themselves and their habitat." And the US military is the biggest consumer of fossil fuels. So we also have this other challenge of, on top of the symbolic loss of power that this would be perceived to kind of take a step back from being understood as one of the most powerful actors in the world right now, there's also just the operational changes that would need to occur to walk back from fossil fuel dependence with something as simple as military operations. So the reason I think militarism presents a challenge to degrowth, and this conversations about anti-militarism have to go hand in hand with this, is because this all needs to happen at the same time. It's not going to be possible to achieve these degrowth goals without also becoming an anti-militaristic society. How are we on time, by the way?
We're good.
Okay. I will just quickly give a little bit of insight into just a couple points I think that are helpful when, I think I've painted a bit of a bleak scenario, but it's also useful to understand the challenges that lay ahead and the power dynamics that are at play. But I think there are so many things that we can do, so many practical steps we can take in the right direction. And I always like to draw a distinction between short-term goals, which focus on sort of resistance within existing systems. The system itself doesn't change, but we can start to take steps to create different norms and do things differently. And then we've got the longer term goal of the systemic overhaul, and we're just dismantling everything and rebuilding it from scratch. So we have very, very localized individual things that we can do every day, and this is very simple, just like buying local produce, right? This is something that's been pushed a lot on us as individual consumers, that our choices shape our society. This is very true. This is 100% true, but this can't be disconnected from, socioeconomic reality, which is that only people with a certain socioeconomic level can actually make these choices. Class plays a huge role in who is able to take that individual action. And this is also a bit of a scapegoat for states and for corporations to say, oh, well, if everyone just, buys less plastic bags, like that's the climate crisis solved. So we can talk about these small steps, and yes, they're important to take where we can take them, but this linkage to policy change, to holding states accountable, to holding corporations accountable, has to be happening at the same time. I don't think either one of these things can really be divorced from the other. And just kind of on a last note, I'll just quickly say that for me, this comes back to the three big hierarchies that I see as shaping our society, which is patriarchy, capitalism, and white supremacy. And unless we very seriously engage with how these power hierarchies shape our understanding of the world, our interactions with the world, our behavior, I think it will be tough to do any sort of change, to, you know, act on degrowth principles, to act on feminist principles, this link all the way from the short-term goals all the way up to these big picture systems. It needs to be all super interconnected, and that's where I see this kind of fusion of feminist thinking and the degrowth movement. I just see it as perfectly complementary. I think there's so much we can do to help each other. I'll stop there.
Marissa, thank you. I'm now going to hand over to Frank, but I think, Frank, you need
Do you
to.
wanna,
Yeah, but not in the start of my, I'm in very in the middle. It was, if I would stick it in front of that, so it's pretty much in the, Blair Sun area. So, I'm going to hand over to you. And it's, these, this is not stable. Oh, that's fine, that's good, that's good. Yeah. Okay. So in old school lecturer format, you have your blackboard or your whiteboard here. Thanks a lot.
Over to you. But before, maybe just a brief introduction, if I may. So Frank Meeussen is the diplomatic advisor to Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Mobility, George Gilkinet, in the federal government of Belgium. He advises Minister Gilkinet in the fields of foreign affairs and defence in his role as Deputy Prime Minister. Minister Gilkinet is from Ecolo, the French-speaking Green Party of Belgium. Before, Frank was Deputy Director of the Arms Control and Non-Proliferation Division in the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and as alternate chair of the Council Working Party on Arms Export Control, Frank worked for 4.5 years for the European External Action Service, EAS. Before, he worked on international security, conflict prevention, arms control, and human rights for civil society, including for Pax Christi and Amnesty International, and for Green Federal Deputy Prime Minister Magda Alvear between 1999 and 2003. Frank studied in Antwerp and Strasbourg and holds a master's degree in international relations, and has been a member of the Flemish Green Party since 1992, and was elected municipal councillor for the Green Party in his hometown, Brandstad. And I hope I've got some of those pronunciations right. I'm assuming I've got some of them wrong as well. So over to you, Frank.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you for inviting me. So first, I have to make clear I don't speak on behalf of the Belgian government, and also not on behalf of the Belgian Greens. So I speak here as an individual, but of course as a Green since decades, and also a Green that is really into international security. That's a bit my expertise. So on, let's say my focus, my expertise has been on human rights, arms control, international security, less on post-growth, but I've been involved in this project of the European Green Foundation since a year now, so I'm learning a lot, and it's also very interesting to participate in these events. Well, first, of course, post-growth and degrowth is a means to an end. It's not an objective as such, and it serves, well, it wants to contribute to our, let's say, what we strive for. This is security and safety, freedom, peace, a livable planet. So in order to get there, this is one of the strategies that is proposed to look for post-growth in order to save, to deal with the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and also, of course, for sustainable development. Because there is, of course, a big threat with the climate change and the biodiversity crisis. So we have to look what can post-growth offer to this threat, and I think this is what you all have expertise to. But besides the climate and biodiversity threat, there are also other threats. Unfortunately, well, there is, of course, for example, the pandemic threat, and partly this has to do with climate change, because viruses are more proliferating also due to climate change. But on the other hand, infectious disease was #1 cause of death until deep in the 20th century, before climate change. So we also, but now we have developed technology and pharmacy to deal, to handle pandemics. So will degrowth or post-growth, will it have an effect on our capacity to deal with infectious disease and pandemics? Because it's also a very important threat. Then there is also the threat of populism and undermining of democracy that we witness on a daily basis, also fed by fake news and everything. But populism is also finding a root cause in inequality in societies, where people find themselves unjustly treated by the economic system. And of course, traditionally, there's a link between social protection and growth. Economic, well, at least in my country, not in all, like in the United States, there is no such link. But in my country, there is a link between economic growth and social protection. So if we are moving to post-growth, how are we going to maintain social protection? Also, in order to be able to fight populism and the undermining of democracy by extreme left and extreme right political parties. But this is not the topic of today. I will focus on international security. What will be the effect of post-growth on international security, and let's say our capacity to protect our society against military aggression? And there, of course, if you want to protect yourself against military aggression, of course, you have to look at the root causes of military aggression. But on the other side, you also have to be able to deter aggression and to defend yourself in case you're attacked. And this is considered as one of the core functions of a government, of a society, of a government, of a state, the protection of its citizens. So we have to look at the effect of degrowth. And let's say from a green perspective, so we are mainly focusing at the climate threat, the biodiversity threat, sustainable development, and there degrowth plays an important role. But when we look at this international security issue, I think we as Greens, we need to develop an answer to this, because just saying, oh, it's not important, won't help our cause. Well, you can say degrowth will lead to a reduction of the root causes of military conflict. Well, let's hope so, but we cannot prove that. We cannot be 100% sure. But now I'll use my little thing here. So you were talking about militarism. So this is, let's say, a table with on the horizontal axis firepower. So that's the number of weapons that a state has as a military firepower, and the other axis is the number about your security. So, and this is the 0 point. So here you have 0 firepower and 0 security. Okay, the militarists, they say when you have no weapons, you have no security, and the more weapons, the better. So that goes like that. Let's say the pure pacifists, they say best of all not to have weapons at all. So maximum security with 0 weapons. And the more weapons you have, the less security you have. Let's say, I think that the model is in fact something like this, that you have, well, I agree with if you have 0 weapons, that you can, let's say, invite aggressors to come over to your country. So you should not have that, but you can also have too much weapons. So I think there is a sort of an optimum here, that you have, let's say, a number of weapons with military means and with maximum security. And if you have more military means, your security decreases. And this has been demonstrated in the Cold War when the Soviets and the Americans realized that having arsenals of 60,000 nukes, which cost like enormous amounts of money, and with all these near accidents and near misses and all these things, that this was not contributing to security. So even the militarists in the US and the Soviet Union realized this. But there's also the means that you can only spend £1 one time. And if all the money that goes to weapons cannot go to healthcare, education, and other international solidarity. So this is also a reason why past a certain point, more money on weapons is less security. Okay, now what do the Greens say? Well, the Greens, let's say the mainstream parties will say that this optimum is somewhere here. And I think as Greens, we say, let's say it's here. For example, in Belgium, there is a discussion about 2% for 2% of the national product has to go to the military budget at 2%. That's the NATO group. In Belgium, we said, no. So we are I think there are 3 NATO member states that have not said that they will move to 2% of their national, 2% defense budget of their national product, because we think it's a bit too much for, I'm not going to elaborate on this, but we think that NATO is already spending like 57% of what the world spends on weapons is spent by NATO member states. And so we think that global security will not be increased when this goes to 70% or something. So that's something very completely that we think that we already are sufficiently safe with less money spent on weapons. So, and then, yes. So I think it's essential. Well, so first, I think it's unacceptable when degrowth or post-growth leads to a situation when a country is not capable anymore to defend itself against military aggression. This is unacceptable. But on the other hand, you should be, well, you can spend way too much money on weapons, leading not to more security. So I think our goal as a green political party, because we're not a movement, we are a political party, so we have to make deals and we have to be pragmatic about our goals. Yeah. Yeah, okay, back again now. So, yeah, on nuclear disarmament, because now we are in a situation where it was always said that nuclear deterrence works and there will never be a nuclear conflict. Well, at the same time now, Putin is threatening to use, Russia is threatening to use nuclear weapons. Russia, the Duma this week will vote a de-ratification law for leaving the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. That's a treaty that prohibits nuclear tests. And at the same time, satellites see that they're testing installations in the north of Siberia that have been very passive in the past decades, that there is activity again. So just to illustrate that maybe this whole, the hopeful, optimistic model about nuclear deterrence, that it would lead to stability, well, let's keep hoping. But finally, if nukes continue to exist, they will be used. That's something that you can be sure of. So the only way to protect the world against a nuclear war is to get rid of nuclear weapons as a whole. And we Greens, we are not in favor of unilateral total disarmament. That we don't say that UK, France, and US have to put all their nukes away, while the Russians and the Chinese and the Israeli and the Pakistani and the Indian and the North Koreans keep their nukes. But we are, unlike maybe mainstream parties, in favor of unilateral reductions in order to show our will to really go for nuclear disarmament and to build confidence, so-called confidence building measures. But enough talk on nukes. I also, to what Casper was saying, China, because of course there is conventional weapons and you have nuclear weapons, but you have also these new technologies, artificial intelligence, quantum technology, biotech, and human enhancement, and autonomy in weapons, especially in combination with AI and robots, the militarization of space, and all these terrains are also developed by superpowers for military purposes. And this is, of course, absorbing a lot of money. So in order to, let's say, mitigate the risk for an arms race, and also to avoid that all this money that we need for a lot of very good things goes into that, we really need arms control agreements, and we need to reinvigorate these negotiations. For example, on artificial intelligence, legal autonomous weapon system, killer robots, they should be prohibited. And this is not a naive statement. A lot of weapons have been prohibited successfully, biological weapons, chemical weapons. Of course, you say, yeah, but Syria has used chemical weapons. That's true. But it's like, when we have a global norm, this is quite important. It doesn't mean that it doesn't happen anymore, but anyway, there is reason for optimism for the capacity of arms control to mitigate these risks. So that's maybe, I will stop here just by underlining that I think the role for the Greens in this debate, linked with international security, but also linked with post-growth, is the role and the importance of arms control as a precondition for moving towards post-growth while maintaining the capacity to defend ourselves against military aggression.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you, Marissa. Is anyone would like to comment on or ask questions of our speakers in this second session? Right, we've certainly got a flurry of hands now. So let's start within the room. And if you're online and you'd like to ask a question, if you can use the electronic hand raising device, because I may not see your hand unless it's bright yellow. But let's start with the non-yellow hands in the room, if I may. So I think first had the second row, and then she stood at the front. Yeah. Sorry.
Maybe I'll answer repeat questions.
Yeah, that's good. If you
Do you want to come over here so they can see you?
come over here and project. There you go.
Thank you for these presentations. Okay. I wanted to ask a question about unilateral. I wanted to ask a question about unilateral disarmament. I think fundamentally degrowth is a really time-sensitive proposal. If we're really serious about degrowth, it's pretty much in the next 10 to 15 years for it to be a meaningful transition, which means, from my perspective, we need quite brave policy programs. And so I come from an international relations background, and the key concept in IR is the idea of like the security dilemma, which, as you might know, is a nation can either choose to kind of gather arms, which then might lead to a concomitant arms gathering from the other side, which produces arms races, or they can choose to not defend themselves, but then that risks them not having any security because there's this kind of fundamental uncertainty because you don't know what the other actor is doing. I guess my point is this produces a race to the bottom. No one really wins in this situation, so you have constant arm races, you have any level of weapons. And the degrowth agenda is we need to reduce production and consumption in socially useless and ecologically destructive areas of production, the military being a very, very, very obvious one. So I guess my question is, why don't we back unilateral disarmament given, I mean, there's plenty of very compelling literature, especially coming out from the Cold War, about how unilateral disarmament, if done in a transparent fashion, kind of reduces this fog of war problem we have when we're thinking about disarmament, does the other person still have weapons, So yeah, I guess this is especially important given, to me, it seems less realistic for us to think we can like get to some sort of multilateral solution with China and Russia in the next 10 years about disarmament.
Right. Well, let's move on to the answer from Abe, from Marissa and Frank. Drop back, because I think we've got another 3 questions before we might invite some others to hopefully join us from the first session for a wider endpoint. So I don't know if Frank or Marissa would like to go first on this particular question. Yes.
Yes. So unilateral total disarmament. This would put us at the mercy, I think that's a good English expression, of the Putins and Bashar al-Assad's and Kim Jong-un's of this world. And purely electorally, I don't think that you could have let's say, a majority, an electoral majority for that, just because of the distrust. But also the problem with weapons, the problem with weapons is the following: it's a leverage for power. And if you have 100 people, nice, good, kind people, Greens, in fact, and you have one person with an automatic rifle, this one person will rule them all, just because of the weapon. So if one person is not so very good and obtains a weapon, this person can control everybody. So this is a risk which is unacceptable to take. Because even if the world is fantastic, if one nation keeps everybody disarmed, but one nation, for example, that's the problem with the concept of strategic warfare. It's the Roman legions. They came to Belgium and they said, we are the boss. And when there was an insurgence, they did a total genocide. So 3 entire Belgian tribes, Belgium didn't exist then, but on the territory, were entirely genocided by the Roman legions. Just because they did an insurrection, and they, from the babies till, and this concept of strategic warfare in Holland, Hitler destroyed Rotterdam because the Luftwaffe was able to do that, and the Dutch Air Force was not capable of responding. And Hitler said, today Rotterdam, tomorrow The Hague, the day after Amsterdam. So what are you gonna say? And then the Dutch government said, okay, you win. So we don't want to undergo this. And that's the reason why we need our capacity to defend ourselves.
So, Marissa, how do you see this?
Oh, it's such a issue. I think the timeline of 10 to 15 years is not realistic, really. I I think this war in Ukraine has kind of flipped everything on its head. Up until this point, the UK was comfortable talking about disarmament, and now it's changed course and it's building more nuclear weapons. So I think we've and not just just focus on nuclear weapons, but again, I think it's a really good example of a particular situation of power and dominance and implications this has for everything else. I think again, this kind of is something that needs to be hit from a lot of different angles. We need to think conceptually about the normalization of violence and the threat of violence through deterrence as a way that we keep our peace. We need to look at the reality of what's happening right now in the geopolitical context and the history, why people think the way they think, the fears they have that drive them to behave certain ways. And I personally think the way forward is to go at it by looking at specific weaponry and banning specific weaponry. So we do a lot on lethal autonomous weapons and work with the UK government to kind of get a concise decision that this is something that should be banned before it exists. And same, I think, banning nuclear weapons is quite an uphill battle, but it would be a really significant success into walking back from this need to threaten violence in order to maintain peace. And I think it's almost like this piecemeal way that we have to go at it. But it's going to be so slow. It's upending everything that's normalized, has been normalized in our society under patriarchy for thousands of years now. That's a slow journey.
So I see that there's two issues there. One is about time, and the other is about, do we deal with degrowth or peace within an assumption that the states and governments will stay as it is, or how do we need to shift governance, and and I think for me the wider challenge, which maybe underpins both the economic session and this session here, is if we really want to demilitarize our global relations, but also we want to degrow our economic aspirations, then we need to have fast changes in governance, both within countries and between countries. And maybe that's something which we might come on to when we bring everyone together. Let's go online now, because I'm very conscious we've got an online room and an in-person room. And I think both of you asked one question already, so let's go to Pritham first, and then we'll come back to Reinhardt after we've come back to the room. Okay. So Pritham, your question, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much. My first question is to Marissa, that it was very interesting you brought in the feminist argument in militarization, masculinity, etc. But the fact that it has been some of the women who've been responsible for militarization. For example, it is in India, it's Indira Gandhi was the prime minister when the first nuclear test took place. Margaret Thatcher was involved in the Argentina war and very militaristic outlook. I mean, you might say that they have imbibed male ideology, but that doesn't really solve the problem. When we find a deviant course, we just kind of try to escape it by saying that though they are women, but they haven't got the feminist outlook. They are still in the masculine outlook. So I find a bit of a problem in that if only men could be removed from structures of power, there will be likelihood of peace, because we have seen when women are power, they have pursued equally disastrous or sometimes even more dangerous militaristic strategies. And my second question is to Frank. It's not so much about the armament part which you mentioned, which is sensible, but in the first beginning part, where you argued that growth is associated with democracy, that when economic growth takes place, and that's not something unique view. There is a lot of literature that economic growth leads to middle class, growth of middle class are the forces for democracy, and that's why in the West, there has been economic growth and the growth of middle class, and people give the example of Thailand, other countries, where also some kind of growth and middle class took place. But the point is that, this growth has taken place by depriving a large part of the world of the resources and the exploitation of that world. So it's not a simple equation that if you just follow the path of growth, it will lead to a middle class. Middle class stands for democracy, and that probably will lead to a more peaceful end. It's a more complex relationship. So it's not directly linked with the second part of your presentation, but the first few, introductory remarks.
Okay. Well, let me ask you both to respond to those points. And then what I might do is take the next questions in pairs, so we can finish on time. So in all, I think Marissa and then Frank, if I may.
Yes. So I disagree with your assessment of feminism, and I do not think all women are peaceful. I think assuming that more women in government means more peace is just an inaccurate reading of human behavior for a couple reasons. First of all, that kind of framing puts the burden of peacekeeping on women, rather than seeing this as a project for everyone to participate in. You don't need to be of a certain gender to buy into feminist philosophy, feminist principles. There are many great feminist men. There are many women who are pro-patriarchy, and I think though there is a very, very clear root in women's oppression, you do not have to be a woman to be feminist, and just because you're a woman, you're not going to be feminist. I think there's also a lot of, how do I want to say this? Politics, until so recently, was just the realm of men. Very, very recently. It wasn't even until the 70s that women could have their own bank account in the US and the UK. These are my two contexts. So women's participation in the public life, I'm kind of like one of the first generations that can have the level of freedom and participation in policy and politics. Even my mom's generation really struggled to do this. And so women entering into politics or policy, I would, especially politics and government, there's a level of buy-in that you have to do to the existing system to be taken seriously. Because if I tried to run as an MP, or if I tried to walk into parliament like feminist flags flying, no one would take me seriously. No one would elect me, So I think there's also, because of the way we understand how policy works, the gendered stereotypes we as a society have around who makes a good policymaker, we're only going to see kind of a certain type of people. And I would argue that women have a higher expectation to adhere to these kind of stereotypical masculine roles in order to achieve these high positions of power. And that means towing that patriarchal line. So I would just suggest that, what I'm saying is I agree with you. I don't think we should be saying we need more women. That's not the answer. That's part of the answer. For sure, we need to get better diversity and representation. Women are a part of that, but so are non-binary people, so are trans people, so are people of all different races. We should have kind of a balance of representation based on society's demographics in our political leadership as well. This, to me, is just common sense. People have different lived experiences. The more lived experiences involved in policy making, we're gonna just get better policy. I'll stop there. I could talk so much about this, but I'll stop there.
It's good to have that distinction between women and feminism, I think, in this debate. Frank, the question about the wider impacts, I think, of economic growth and who really benefits. Although I think I would say that the economic growth we've had in the UK in the last few years certainly really hasn't benefited the middle class, but there we go.
It's just on feminist foreign policy. we're currently preparing our platforms for next year's elections, and this will be in our electoral platform of the Belgian Greens, so feminist foreign policy. So, and then the question between the link between growth and middle class, and I 100% agree, so that there is not an automatic link. The link that in Belgium, so social security is quite expensive because we have quite a reforming public health system, which costs a lot of money, really a lot. And so this is of course linked with, well, the money that the government can spend on social security is of course linked with the taxes that they can raise, and depends also on the economy. So that there is a link, but of course this link doesn't have to be absolute, and it's possible to go post-growth and still preserve social protection. But this is something you have to keep very well. This is really a very important topic, because otherwise you risk to increase inequality and support populism and undermine democracy. And just one thing, because maybe on weapons, if I can, and this was still going on to the question from, follow up to the question from the audience. Maybe what I said is a little bit pessimistic, but it shouldn't be, in the sense that, well, let's say long ago, people felt the need to arm themselves in order to protect their family. This is now not necessary anymore in Europe because of the state monopoly for violence, and of course, a similar model we can think about to reduce the need for national or collective defense organizations when you grow more to an international multilateral rule of law. And I think finally, in the long run, this is the solution for wars and for conflicts. Of course, with all the necessary checks and balances, because we don't need a global superpower government, because this would be very bad. But I think a world without national armies is thinkable, but in the context of a global multilateral order.
Well, let me go back to the audience once again. So let's again start with the room, and then we'll go online. So yes.
I was going to ask about, you can repeat the question, about a green police force, a green army. This is something that the United Nations, for example, has continuously done, supported an intermediary army that protects, comes in when there's an aggressive force. Neither of you mentioned it, much to my surprise. I would have thought that was something that was essential. Do you both agree with such a thing? How do you think it should be constituted? Briefly, of course.
So the first question there was about the potential for a green police as opposed to green peace force internationally, and how it might be constituted and what its role might be. But let me go to Reinhardt as well online. I think you had a question. If you can unmute or be unmuted, whichever way it is. Yeah. Okay, almost like yes. Okay, Reinhardt.
Okay, I think partially my question has already been raised. I mean, I think Frank, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, Frank has raised this issue of the dilemma between pacifists and militarists. And for me, the idea is, I put it in the chat, should the protection of citizens from military threats during a transition period of demilitarization be transferred from states to an international organization? And for me, the European Union could be the first supranational organization to test this approach. This means there will be no more national army, and each country could save considerable resources for social goals. The arms industry would be non-profit and under international control. And another issue would be then, one could be really certain that European countries could not fight against each other. I mean, at the moment, it's always said that European countries will not do it because of the EU. But when we see the development of the EU in the last few years, I'm not so certain about it. And I'm actually quite worried that the EU may actually fall apart and national interests may dominate again. So I think these previous speakers have also raised similar questions. And I wonder why this idea has never been sort of raised at the European Union level, because considerable resources could also be saved in this way. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. So again, I think maybe between you can share those questions out, but I just want to give notice to Casper in the room and Peter online. Maybe if you'd like to come forward after these this round of answers. And what I might do is ask both Casper and Peter if you'd like to start by sharing your reflections on the second session and any things that you would like to prompt to Marissa and Frank, and then I'll give Marissa and Frank the final words of the afternoon so we finish on time. So first on that round, I don't know if either of you would like to start on the green police role that may or may not be played internationally. I guess that has a relationship to European United Nations.
It was just before you asked your question, I made a reference to this multilateral order where the world, because now there is the rule of law at country level and also less or more on the European level, but that we move towards a world when there is a rule of law on a global level, and that would imply, of course, also sort of United Nations force, green force, or well, there are now already blue helmets, but this would need to be developed further in order, if you want countries to give up their national defense, they would need more assurance from. So this is something I think that finally, on the long run, we will be moving towards. Also, the question of Reinhard, why not? Well, as an intermediate step to have a European army. Well, my compatriot Guy Verhofstadt, who is now the leader of Renew in the European Parliament, wrote a book about that 20 years ago, and he was really ridiculized for that. So apparently it's way too early to talk about European army, but we are moving in that direction. Now, the thing which is good, but which is bad, not so good, is that the idea that you can save a lot of money with that. You can save some money, but not a lot. So we should not overestimate, because we would still need, well, in order to, have a credible deterrent, it would still cost a lot of money. But I also think that indeed, first move to a European military approach and then to a global force that is there to make countries comply and to enforce the international law and to protect countries, and intervene in case of blatant violations of law, of international humanitarian law and human rights. I think this is finally the objective that we need to move to. Yeah. Thank you.
Just to say, I honestly agree with what you've outlined. I think moving towards some sort of global, I don't want to say protection. I just fundamentally think violence and the military is just not how we should be handling things. But as a step to get to that point, that societal shift, kind of rolling out something like peacekeeping on a bigger scale, I think falls into that plan at some point. I don't think we're there yet. I look at the US, the chasm between the way the US has designed their military and what peacekeeping is. It's just, there's a lot that needs to happen before we could even start considering big countries like the US signing up to something like this. But it's certainly, an interesting, very intriguing solution.
I wonder if also as we do have increases amounts of climate breakdown and escalating natural disasters in the future, there might be a role more for that kind of body to intervene in humanitarian situations to make sure they don't evolve into conflict and act as more of a humanitarian intervention force of some way. But may I invite Casper to come back and join us here? And I don't know if Peter, you're online or not. But if you are, please drop your video on and join us for this on a session. I wonder if I might be the academic-ish amongst us and just reflect on Frank's flip chart behind, because it talks about there being a place where security improves before it reduces again, and I kind of imagined that, well, you could put well-being up here and you could put growth along the bottom, but there is a point by which increasing amounts of consumption, the increasing amount of growth you have, well-being in many countries starts to fall off, and happiness reduces. So there is maybe a wider conceptualization that on the one hand people think that you can have economic growth, rather you can have more militarism, rather somehow they're tied together, but actually we need to maybe untie the idea that continual growth in militarism or material or energy consumption is somehow a good thing. We need to limit that and maybe move ourselves in a position, in a way where our well-being is not defined by our level of consumption. Maybe we can throw these graphs out the window and just focus on our relationships with each other instead. But I'll do that right now. We're going to move. Whoa! Don't turn some rates in any way. That's all good. So I don't know which order. Maybe Casper first, if I may, and then come to you, Peter, online before we close the session up. And by all means, if anyone else would like to chip in with comments or thoughts in the chat or with a final hand, please feel free to do so. Casper.
Thank you. Yeah, it was very insightful and inspiring roundtable, I think. I don't really like my role, though. I think generally when I'm among my progressive friends and other Greens, is that I share all the idealism and all the goals, but having lived in a dictatorship, being able to speak the language and follow the narrative, I think when I hear things like that we should have a global force that keeps the peace and that can stand up to evildoers, I agree with all of it. But I think in many ways we're moving away from that, like the international order is becoming more fragmented. And yeah, I just see this gap basically between our idealism and how we should get there. And I think a lot of progressives, I'm not saying you actually, but a lot of progressives prefer not to really discuss that so much. So how put it in a more positive manner, like how can our progressive values actually be an asset for us? Yeah, which should maybe enter the discussion when we speak about disarmament, unilateral or otherwise, and rule of law on a global level. I think we should not underestimate the challenges of that we're moving in another direction, and that other powers are now coming on the scene that absolutely are not only not having the debates that we're having among our friends in this room, but are resolutely opposed to everything we're proposing. And nonetheless, I do think our ideals are valuable and can be an asset. So maybe I was just to head back to you guys, yes.
Say how.
Yeah. So that's what I would want to discuss, because I do agree with Marissa, for example, what you're saying about feminist foreign policy. I actually totally believe it would be a great asset for us, 100%. But I do notice, let's say, if I have discussions with people in the Dutch Foreign Ministry or whatever, or in Brussels, people kind of laugh, right? Like, how could that help in challenging China or Russia? And I don't agree with them at all. We should make that argument, but I was wondering how you would answer their criticism, where you could elaborate how it could actually be an asset for us, which I also believe.
Thank you. May I just jump online to you, Peter? Your reflections on the last session and any closing remarks you'd like to make.
Sure. Well, I mean, firstly, thanks very much to Frank and Marissa. It was a fantastic set of interventions. I mean, for me, well, I'm really grateful to Marissa really for planting the issue of power squarely on the agenda here, because I think that's crucial in how we link security, economy, geopolitics, because it is that question of whose security we're talking about and what is it that is to be secured. Because if it's the biosphere and a livable planet, then that immediately takes us to questions of growth and how we generate wealth and on whose behalf and how and so on. So we start to sort of see the connections between these things, because, you know, the questions about what we secure, what we protect, are also about what we value. And again, I think that's where a feminist analysis is really useful. You know, what is it that ultimately sustains a lot of the wealth that's generated in our economies? It's care economies, it's reciprocity, and it's mutual aid, and all these things that, you know, women carry that burden far more than men. But we need to start thinking about, you know, the actually existing economy which sustains our societies and the ecosystems that we're trying to protect. So I think there's something very interesting there, because if we unpack what geopolitics is all about, really, obviously there's the security dimension and the competition that we've talked about, but there's also the economic dimension, because it's often competition over resources. And I think as Greens, you know, we need to sort of challenge some of the core assumptions about each of these things and the way in which they're interconnected. And for me, that is about power shifts in the way that both of you, I think, well, several people have described. Obviously, it's challenging the gender and racial inequalities, but it's also reasserting control over the military. I mean, I very much hear what Frank says. I like that attempt to try and navigate some realism, not in the way IR people talk about, but realism as in, how do we make sure that basic functions of defense and protection and deterrence are still there, whilst going on a trajectory which is demilitarizing, because I think that's the crucial thing. And for me, that also then brings in, whereas the power shift over the economy, control over the economy, the imbalance between capital and labor, between state and business, those sorts of things need to be addressed. But it also speaks to this question of the tension or the temporal aspect that was flagged before. So how do we spell out an alternative and an attractive vision for a different global order, if you like, but at the same time have realistic, short-term, politically viable propositions? And I think that's the sort of the key challenge, because for people to start taking seriously whether it's ideas about green armies or about rejuvenating arms control treaties or whatever it might be, we have to have a sense of how that fits into a bigger picture which connects the things I was just talking about. So we always have to have in mind, I think, that bigger picture of where we would like to get to, and the idea that there is an alternative world and that it is possible. In fact, it exists already in different parts of the world. So challenging this sort of notion that this is as good as it gets, and that this is the natural and the only way in which you can organize security and politics and all of that. So pushing back against that idea concretely, but then having these, you know, very specific policies in place at the same time, I think. So holding those two things, that's how I at least sort of think about that temporal dimension, not just coming up with ideal worlds when the clock is ticking and we need to intervene in the here and now, but having those sort of concrete suggestions. But for me, always, as Greens, we're in a really good position, it strikes me, to make those connections between economy, security, geopolitics, you know, like, because they are so intimately intertwined. And I think most conventional thinking really doesn't have an account of what's causing insecurity, what's causing breakdowns in ecological and social wealth, whereas Greens do. And I think we need to be on the forefront a bit more, a bit on the front foot in sort of articulating attractive visions. But having to, you know, we that doesn't let us off the responsibility to come up with short-term, you know, ideas and concrete policy propositions. So, you know, I welcome those interventions a lot, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Let's just, for our final bring us back to the room. So, Frank, if I may, and then I'll ask Marissa as host here, final word. Frank, any final thoughts that you'd like to add? You've heard sort of Casper and Peter coming back in from the economic perspective. I mean, I feel a little bit that we've got the pressure of degrowth and degrowth thinking in the room, saying, you know, faster, come on, climate emergency, 10 years, 15 years, we need to get there. We have the policies, where is the governance? And then it feels like the challenge within the government sphere is you say, well, hang on a second, we live in the real world, we have to deal with the governments, and they're not where you want us to be. So how do we progress from where we are now to where we want to be? You know, progress from realism with pragmatism towards this idealism and hope, you know, in the economic sphere and in the peaceful geopolitical relations sphere at the same time, at the same pace. And what's stopping us? What's holding us back? And what maybe can help us to accelerate forward a little bit faster than we're seeing our leaders doing so today. I mean, you're supporting the deputy of a state, Belgium in Europe, and Europe's one of the big players geopolitically. I mean, what sort of leaders do you think we should be pushing that aren't being pushed today, that maybe, I might unlock something, might free something up to act where it's currently not? Maybe making that role.
Well, I think we should have confidence in our own conviction and vision, and it's the role of the Greens to have this long-term view with maybe objectives that now seem unrealistic. But I mean, the Greens have been saying things in the 80s, rights for LGBTIQ+, then we were totally isolated. And then same-sex marriage, first in Belgium in '95, all the other parties, also the socialists, were really condemning us, the Greens. So, but and now it's everybody, even in Belgium, the extreme right, Vlaams Belang Party, they are in favor of LGBTIQ+ rights. So that's how the situation is now. So I think it's our role and our responsibility to have long-term visions and goals, even if there's maybe if it seems not popular or if it doesn't have a very big electoral support. I think that's very important. But for the post-growth, I think we really need to look at this security issue very, very thoughtfully. For example, I will give one example. If you talk to, I don't know whether in the audience there is somebody from Poland, but I think, knowing the Poles, I know some, if you ask, if you have to choose between the very bad consequences of climate change or occupation by Nazis/Soviets, they will go anytime for the climate change, because they don't want, again, to live under Nazi or Soviet rule. So if you bring this post-growth as, this will help climate and biodiversity, but for security, we hope it will work, then the Poles will not support you. So this is really something that we have to take into account in order to sell our project.
Well, that's Marissa. Thank you for hosting us today, and your final thoughts.
Oh, the pressure of being the last one, my goodness. I mean, everything that Christian said is so insightful, so I think I'll try and just speak on this feminist foreign policy piece. It's just a little thing for us to mull over as we get on the tube and the trains back home. When I started my work on feminist foreign policy, Sweden was the only country that had a feminist foreign policy. They had rolled out a policy framework, so it was clear what this meant. It was increasing the rights and representation of women, increasing the resourcing of gender equality initiatives. And this was all kind of externally focused. So these principles weren't really implemented domestically in the same way. I was so intrigued by what bringing feminism into foreign policy meant, because they're in opposition, pretty much. Feminist principles and the way foreign policy operates now, a little bit like oil and water. And I think the intrigue in feminism, and for the first time this word not being taboo in multilateral spaces within governments, is fascinating and such a landmark. I will say that what I have seen since of uptake of feminist foreign policy is completely lacking in substance. It's a branding exercise. It's a way to virtue signal. There are almost no countries that are currently engaging with it have actually published any level of policy platform. So there's a real co-optation of feminism happening in this process. I think there are some that are doing it decently well. The Scottish National Party have been going through consultations to develop their own feminist foreign policy. I think they're taking a lot of that kind of critique to heart. This is an idea that generated out of grassroots organizing and activism, and those very people that have been the original feminist thinkers have been shut out by governments who have now kind of taken on this label as this kind kind of thing to wear and show up at the UN and talk about feminism. So I would love to talk to both of you about this more. I'm full of opinions. But I think there's, we can have this ideal of like, okay, let's just take feminism. What are these principles that we're striving towards? Or take degrowth. What are these principles that we're striving towards? Some of them are quite utopian, right? And to me, this is the lovely feminist piece of it, is this balance of the short-term goals, which are operating under the existing system, and dealing with the reality of what that means. So dealing with the fact that China's not going to engage with feminism, they're not going to become feminists overnight. We're not going to be able to sit down and have tea with them and talk about the ethics of care and this type of thing. So the history, the context of why people today are behaving the way they're behaving is necessary to acknowledge and to grapple with. And that means sitting in discomfort with the values and the way we want things to be, but acknowledging the reality of, right now we're in the middle of a war. I saw think pieces on like, oh, if Ukraine had a feminist foreign policy, like there wouldn't be a war in Ukraine. Like, yeah, if everyone had a feminist foreign policy, there wouldn't be any war, but that's not the reality. It annoyed me so much that people were saying this, because it was so devoid of any contextual understanding of what is actually happening in Ukraine right now. So I would say, understanding that acting in resistance to things we don't like can be daily, it can be small, it can be very personal, it can be big, it can be pushing for policy change, but genuinely all of this has to happen at once. I don't think any of these things can kind of happen at one time. We can't stop providing weapons to Ukraine in hopes that we'll all just decide diplomacy is the way forward. This is not realistic. So I think this tension, we have to sit with it. We have to just get comfortable with it and continue to work and then just find these little pieces, these moments that we can push forward. Also, thank you, everyone. I'm very glad to have hosted.
Thank you. I know we've had a few technical difficulties, but we've persisted. We've got to the end. We're both online and in the room. So thank you all for coming. And for those of you listening, hopefully after, once we publish this online, thanks for listening. And thanks again for hosting here in London. Thank you very much.